He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan. So, welcome to Lent, everyone. If you hadn't worked it out from the fact that we opened up service with going through the entirety of what's known as the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, and then confession, which will be up front for us every Sunday in Lent. This is the season. The season every year that Christians take 40 days before Easter to wrestle with all of those things that have caused us to distance ourselves from God, and to reflect on how we might turn ourselves around. Now, we use all kinds of words like sin, and repentance, and covenant, and salvation. But really, what I think all this boils down to is that we are taking this time to face up to all of the ways that humanity kind of keeps pulling away from that path of compassion and caring that God is ever inviting us to walk. We take this 40 days also to prepare. We're preparing for our celebration of Jesus' death and resurrection, which is, of course, God's great answer to all of those very struggles. Yet, here we are. We return year after year to Lent. We keep doing it. Because, yep, you know what? Despite that gracious once and for all act of forgiveness of all of our human failings, whether they be as individuals or the whole of humanity, despite that, we're still falling short of the mark, aren't we, sometimes? I mean, all you have to do is look around us, and it's right out there for us to see. And you know what? In here too, I have to admit. So, you're not alone if you feel like we've been doing this Lent thing for a long time. In fact, in the Bible, 40, the number 40, is code language. It's code language for that amount of time that just feels like it's way too long. It's this thing about time that we express when we're thinking, boy, I am past ready to be done with whatever is going on here. Whether that's wandering for 40 days, 40 weeks, 40 months, or, let's face it, 40 years sometimes. But the thing is, there's always a reason for a 40 in the Bible. There's something more, something that we need to get out of whatever that time of 40 is about. So when we hear about 40s, well, we would do well to pay attention, despite our, innate impatience to just skip ahead, because let's face it, isn't Easter a lot more fun than Lent? But there's things that we need to figure out first. So today we start with the original 40. The 40 days that the rain flooded the earth while Noah and his family and all those animals, 2 by 2, were floating around in that ark all by their little lonesome. Now, the lectionary is making some big assumptions here that we know the whole story, because it's just giving us the very, very ending. But I have to say they are not alone, because our wider culture does the same thing. I mean, I just did a little bit of Googling, and all kinds of stuff comes up about Noah's Ark, right? This was the favorite one that I found yesterday. It was called Everything I Need to Know I Learned from Noah. Here's some of the advice. Plan ahead. It wasn't raining when Noah built the ark. That one appealed to me especially this weekend. For safety's sake, travel in pairs. Number 3, remember the Ark was built by amateurs and the Titanic was built by professionals. And finally, no matter the storm, when you are with God, there's always a rainbow waiting. So that deep familiarity, both here within this community gathered with the wider Christian community, and then right out there in the whole world, is part of what makes this a great story. I mean, it's why we give kids toys so they can reenact it, the animals going on the boat, and it shows up in pretty much every Sunday school curriculum that I have ever seen. It's also the kind of story that we know shows up in lots of cultures too, because it's about something essential, a reset for people and the whole earth. So I think we can figure out why it works as a great starting point for Lent. And not just because, as the lectionary likes to sort of fit together its puzzle pieces, because, yep, there's that number 40. It's also a story about a time when God needed a change of heart. Now, I have to say, it's easy for us to sort of jump past that part of the story, especially when we jump in right at the end. But who remembers why the flood happened to begin with? Go ahead, Trish.
I'm not sure if it was Sodom and Gomorrah, but it was some town where people were acting really terribly.
So you're close. You're close. There's a whole passage, and it's definitely one of the more interesting. There's signs. This is something mythological going here. That human beings were acting violently and badly. There's some implication that it has something to do with them interbreeding with spiritual creatures from heaven, and I don't know. It's an interesting part of the Bible. But you get through all of that, and then right at the beginning of the Noah story, it kind of gets laid out in front of us. God was upset with how humans were acting in a really specific way. God regrets that humans were, let's face it, filling the earth with violence. So you can take all that mythological sort of meaning making out, and you can look at that statement right there and you can be like, yep. I can see people doing that because we're still doing it today. Humans are filling the earth with violence. Now, I have to say that it's right about that point that I start to feel like, well, God, come on. You're acting a bit like a toddler who tears down their beautifully crafted tower of wooden blocks in this peak of fit. Because you know what? Hasn't lived up to whatever vision they had of it when they created it. God's upset. God regrets the creation. And I have to say, it's also right at that point that I start to ask myself, why? Why do we tell this story to children? Does that make sense? Because there's some pretty tough stuff going on here. I mean, we witness God addressing human violence by unleashing a terrible destruction. I mean, that's not exactly an easy way for us to understand God. But then something happens. Excuse me. Because in the long time of that flood, and sometimes it's both portrayed as 40 days and also as 150 days, and there's a 300 in there also. Just suffice it to say that this is clearly that language for a long, long time. But in that long, long time, God is sitting there, faced with what God has done to his creation. And God is changed by that. And I'm not going to go into all the questions about can God be like this and all that. That's a different Sunday. But I feel like, as the Bible tells it, it's safe for us to say that in that time, that long time, God regrets what God did. God goes from losing it in a big way to making the promise that we hear about today that this will not happen again. And that is a pretty big turnaround, if you ask me. Because in that moment, God makes peace with this creation in all of its imperfections. I mean, it's right there in the wording that we get today, which says, I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Now, the rainbow, right? Who doesn't look up at a rainbow and get this uplifting feeling like, wow, that's a miracle. It's beautiful, it's light, it's color, and it is this promise that sun is coming from the storm, and of course that God means peace for us. But you know, my commentaries tell me that there's something else in here that we might be missing if we stop there, because the word for bow here is very clearly talking about this kind of bow. You know what I mean? A bow and arrow bow. And we're not talking about a fun hobby here. In ancient times, armies had legions of bowmen. I mean, kind of in the same way that we hand guns out to infantry people today. And the bow, it was a primary weapon of war. So here what we have is God saying, I'm going to hang up my weapons. I'm going to call an everlasting truce. I'm storing it away where its only use from here on out will be as a sign of my promise to all of humanity, to all of the animals, to the every last part of creation. This is my promise that you can expect peace from me from here on out. And in this way, God is leading the way for us. Because, you know, here's God admitting, I know it's easy to get wrapped up in cycles of violence and retribution, to let your anger get away with you. But here I'm going to take the first step and show you that we can turn from war to peace. We can turn from fear and lashing out in anger to risk something like trust and acting with love. And I'm going to take the first step. Now, that's huge, don't you think? Because we get to witness God saying, even I sometimes need to step back and get some perspective on where I was and the consequences of what I did. So God changes God's ways. I mean, what a better invitation into Lent than that, right? That's, in fact, what Lent is all about. And I mean, here we are. It's February 18th, 2024, and if ever there was a time when all humanity needed this kind of change of heart, then this feels like this might be the time. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I'm heartsick. I am heartsick from watching the death toll and all the wars raging in Ukraine and Gaza and all kinds of other places. I mean, this past week, people started shooting each other at a celebratory parade for the Super Bowl. Come on. It feels like anger and distrust is on the rise all around us, and we're just powerless to do anything about all of that. But maybe God is inviting us to take some time this year. More time than we might otherwise make in our busy lives to reflect on how we might be called to help make peace in our own lives and in our own time and in the places where we are. Maybe God's saying, you know, take 40 days of time. Ask yourself. How can I hang up the bow? Hang up the bow and turn from making violence to making peace. So God's doing this, saying, set aside your tools and habits that you use to fuel conflict. Ponder this Lenten question. None of us, I think, commands armies. And I don't believe any of us control the kinds of things that carry that kind of great destructive force that we see wreaking havoc in our world. But you know what? Each and every one of us has our words and our actions, and we make choices every day about whether we use them to further division or build reconciliation in the world around us. I firmly believe that the answer to the Lenten question that we are being offered today is that it may feel like we've waited a long time to figure this out, but it takes time to turn this kind of thing around. And so God is with us in this. Not just this year for Lent, but every year for Lent. And guess what? All year round. The good news on this first Sunday in Lent is that God is near. That's what Jesus told us. God is not just sitting above us, judging us every time we find ourselves and the world embroiled in this type of conflict yet again. And Jesus came to walk that path with us because God might have made peace with creation way back so long ago that it sits in the time of before, of primordial, of mythological. But just in case we didn't figure it out, Jesus came to tell us to be baptized, tempted, here to walk with us and demonstrate that God has indeed opened up a new way through the wilderness, a path of compassion and forgiveness and trust and cooperation for all creation. Now, that road may take giving more of ourselves than we might think we are capable of. So let's spend a little more time, all 40 days of it that we've been given in Lent, to ponder this alternative path towards greater peace and how each and every one of us might be called this year to turn and walk in its way. Amen.